Welcome Nadine Maenza, U.S. IRF Commission Chair. And welcome back, Tony Perkins.
Well, it is my privilege now to transition to a discussion with Nadine Maenza, who is the current chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. As a commissioner on USCIRF, I've had the pleasure of serving alongside Nadine for the last 3 years, I think it has been. And we've been able to travel different parts of the world and address many of the issues of religious freedom. And in fact, USCIRF played a role in Dr. Brunson's release, and his remarks were spot on. I'm grateful for Dr. Brunson continuing to be a voice for religious freedom, one that speaks from experience. Nadine, our session this morning, by the way, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Glad to be here. This is a wonderful, wonderful day and wonderful program.
We want to, this panel, this session is about religious nationalism. And so I think oftentimes the best place to start is with defining terms, because I think this term has been used and applied in different ways. So let's just start right there. Let's define what we're talking about here this morning.
Sure. So nationalism oftentimes can be a term people throw around in a negative way, but really civic nationalism is an important part of a community, of a society. It's where people identify as being from their country, identify with their own community, and that cohesion that you need. I mean, when we saw the uprising of the youth in Iraq that were protesting for a better future, that was civic nationalism. That was a good thing. You know, so what's the bad part of the nationalism is that religious or ethnic nationalism, where people identify as being a part of a community, and then anyone that's not in their community is the other. And so that otherness is really the problem, because they're not being inclusive. They're not looking at their neighbor who might have a different religion or ethnicity as being an equal, but seeing them as being less. And so what can happen is, in those instances, as we've seen around the world, is that you know, there's marginalization of those communities and oftentimes persecution. And so that's really kind of the difference between the communities.
But that's not to suggest that religion cannot be a part of this national identity and heritage. It's not like you have to have a public square that's devoid of religion.
Right, it's really the opposite. We find that people of faith that believe their faiths are actually pretty inclusive of others. What we're seeing is when it's used as a tool, usually a political tool, to turn on the other, that's when this nationalism becomes a danger. And the real danger is when the Holocaust Museum has spoken out on this quite a bit, is when the people that, the narrative that the other are danger to my community. So when you're able to turn the tables on these minority communities and make them be dangerous, you saw that in Burma, other places, and that's when you start seeing the violence against minority communities.
So oftentimes when we're talking about religious nationalism, it is using the levers of government then to marginalize or silence those that would fall into what you call the other category.
Exactly. It's really dehumanizing. So there's these steps to genocide that you'll often see, that the nationalism in governments being very proactive, and of course social media has been used. You know, Burma is a great example, where you had these fringe Buddhist nationalist monks who started speaking out against the Muslim community and making it sound like they were a danger to the Buddhist way of life. And they used Facebook. The military government promoted their voices, and over just a few short years, this anti-Muslim nationalism grew with this belief that they were a danger to society. And then you saw them turning on the Rohingya, and particularly, but really all Muslims in Burma and other religious communities as well. And I know when I was in Cox's Bazar at the camps in Bangladesh visiting with Rohingya survivors, and they're telling the story of that August 25th, 2017, when the military attacked them, you know, all their villages, simultaneously committing genocide against them. And we heard Wei Wei Nu tell yesterday how heartbreaking that was. You know, they talked about how the military attacked, but so did their Buddhist neighbors. So that the consequence of that that fringe group just growing, turning, but it was really the government used it as a political tool against religious minorities.
So when we look at, let's from a user perspective, we look at, we basically analyze about 26 countries in particular. I think in our last report we recommended 14 countries for, if I'm not mistaken, for countries of particular concern. Among those, where was the issue of religious nationalism a factor?
Well, I think one of the key ones would be India. We just last year, as many of you know, recommended them to be a country of particular concern for and surprised a lot of people. But the BJP-led government, they continue to promote nationalism as a tool to give them more power. So what you're seeing is, mobs sympathetic to this Hindu nationalism, going after mosques, going after Muslim neighborhoods, destroying homes and businesses because of this theme that is run through this whole country. And this is a country that with a long, beautiful history of pluralism. And so we're hoping that those voices rise up against this nationalist thread.
And so, I mean, that's a good case study when we look at India, because it's not just the fact that this is happening, but it's happening sometimes with government sanctioned,
right.
Or government is not doing anything to stop it. And so that's where we talk about this religious nationalism becoming a tool in
right.
the hands of government to marginalize and restrict the rights and freedoms of others. Are there other examples?
Oh, sure. We've seen, threads of this throughout so many countries in Asia, but also in places like Russia, where you're seeing a nationalist feeling against people of faith in general. So I think governments, there's so many governments would like to see it so that they can use it. So you'll see a government, even in a place like Iran, trying to push, if you're not a Shia, you're not a member of our community, in a way to try to get the majority community to turn on the minorities. And in some areas, it's more successful than others.
There's also some examples of where a country has kind of had religious nationalism, where it has been used
right.
as a tool by government to suppress the rights of minorities, where we've actually seen a transformation.
Sure.
Where they have come back from that to a society that is, where religious freedom is more accepted and more of a pluralistic society, not a secular society, but a society that allows all religions to function equally. Right.
So we've seen, of course, one of the most dangerous examples of this has been the Islamic State, of course. The Sunni nationalism that rose up in Iraq and Syria made a way not just for the Islamic State to develop, because the most dangerous thing that they did is these communities, some of them welcomed them in because they had bought into this ideology as well. And of course, most of the communities that did were sorry because they had not expected them to be so brutal. And so, you had this environment in Iraq and Syria where it was obviously we all know the stories of the horrific atrocities that were committed against religious minorities because of the ideology there. But here in northeast Syria, in Raqqa, is a perfect example of a place where in just 4 years it's gone from being the headquarters of the ISIS caliphate, where ISIS was welcomed, to being a government with some of the best religious freedom conditions in the Middle East, where women are half the leaders. And I think what they have done is built a government that's inclusive. And I think the answer to this is inclusivity, is everyone has a voice, everyone has a seat at the table. You're not shutting out any specific communities, because when you're shutting out those communities, that's when they don't have a voice and they're susceptible to being a part of an extremist group.
Well, yeah, that's actually the opening for the extremist groups
yes.
to come in, because you have a marginalized community that feels they do not have a voice, and out of desperation they find a way to speak.
Right, and I feel like when you look at U.S. government policy in these countries over the last 10 years, and when you have conversations with government officials or even think tank academics, a lot of times the thought is the answer is getting the right guy. Like Iraq, if we just get the right guy. And the right guy, without a framework, isn't going to have a whole lot of power. The key is having an inclusive government that includes all the voices. I mean, how many times people have told me the stories of writing the Constitution in Iraq, and that the Assyrian community was overwhelmed when the U.S. government demanded that it be an Islamic. The Constitution used the word Islamic government, thinking that would be better for them. you know, in the other religious communities were surprised, and even, to be honest, the majority community, that wasn't their intent. Their intent was to build an inclusive society. So I think the U.S. government can do better by looking at these countries holistically and really looking at how, especially after wars, after these fragile situations, and how we can come in and help to build inclusive societies that are able to give everyone a seat at the table, everyone a voice. You know, I think in Northeast Syria, where they really believe that it doesn't matter what your gender, what your ethnicity, what your religion is, you all have the same rights. And you're going to hear in just a little while from the leader there, who wasn't able to join us, who's going to just talk about how they did that in a video. But I think there's other examples of countries.
Well, before we move on to one of the other examples, I just want to state that in your private capacity, you've actually traveled to that region of the world multiple times.
Right.
You've tried to drag me along, but I didn't want to go on vacation with you to Northeast Syria. You've seen this up close and personal, and it's blossomed. It's affected not just the religious freedom aspect, but from that, we saw the beginnings of economic development. I mean, this really does work if we get it right.
And it's the only way forward. I don't find another way forward in these fragile areas other than a government that inclusive, that everyone has equal rights. And so I was able to really do a deep dive in 3 of the regions in Northeast Syria, spent a couple weeks there. So I've spent 7 weeks there in the last 9 months, being able to better understand just how the government works, how they were able to do this, how Raqqa, in particular in the Arab places. I mean, I think in the Kurdish areas, there was some acceptance that they've had these values for a while, but to see them spread into some of the Arab areas was especially interesting to me. And so I was able to understand just how they do that. And like, for instance, they have co-chairs, always a man and a woman of every government position and every committee. And so, but they also have co-chairs that are also a man and woman, but they're always different ethnicities and religions. So you'll see an Arab, a Kurd, and then a Circassian and a Turkmen, or a Christian and a Yazidi, and an Arab and a Kurd. So you have always this combination where we just kept track. It was just interesting how to see the table set for everyone to have a seat at the table.
What surprised you most on your first trip there? Seeing the news, the headlines, what was most surprising that you saw?
It was the simplest thing. The most surprising thing the first time I went was right after the Turkish invasion in November of 2019. And I remember just driving down the road and seeing churches with just steeples. And that, was just a surprising thing to me. I think for me, the moment that was the most surreal moment was being in Kobani on the border with Turkey and sitting with Kurdish Christian converts. There's 2 churches there that are made up entirely of Christian Kurdish converts who had been given a permission or approval to build a church, and just hearing their story of how they're a part of a community, and there's this growing movement there because people can change their faiths, and it's one of the few places in the Middle East where the government allows them to do that.
Another example of where we've seen a country move back from religious nationalism to one that is accepting and religious freedom, not there yet, but they're moving toward it, is Sudan.
Right, and I know you were able to visit there. That is such a remarkable story, and we were thrilled to be able to take them off our list.
Yeah, for almost since the beginning of USCIRF, Sudan was on our list of recommendations for countries of particular concern under Omar al-Bashir. It was an Islamic government, but now under this transitional government, we're seeing a respect for religious freedom. We've met with the transitional prime minister and members of his cabinet. They're working on the educational aspects. But this is one in which, and I think it's instructive for us in the United States when we advocate for religious freedom. This was something that came up from the bottom up, really. This was something that people wanted, and they had a history of this.
Right.
This was wanting to return to the freedoms that they had previously experienced.
Right, and that is why you're seeing this robust conversation about religious freedom there too. So it's not as if there's one person at the top that's trying to change it. It's actually a bottoms-up where there's the entire government, people in different positions that are all trying to change the religious freedom conditions in that country.
And it was fascinating. I was there before the lockdowns from the coronavirus, and so we were able to meet and travel and speak to different ones. And the role that the tea ladies played, these were ladies that would set up alongside the road to sell tea, but it was an economic issue to provide for their families, but they became the strong advocates against government. And what it was encouraging to me to see was that, you know, sometimes we often think we're without power. We're without the ability to take on repressive, overreaching governments. And America plays a key role in certain, just affirming and in encouraging sometimes those that want, breathe for, yearn for that freedom by just standing with them.
Absolutely, and we've seen some other countries move away from authoritarian. Uzbekistan is a wonderful example of a country that the U.S. has stood with, has worked with, and you've seen them move aside. You've seen Taiwan, a country that has moved away from authoritarian rule. So, you know, we spend a lot of time with countries that are problematic, and I think it's super important that we learn from places that have got it right and what worked and what didn't work. And I think the one thing we do know is giving everyone a seat at the table, everyone a say in their own governance, feeling included, and not a secularism, because that's kind of a religion too, right? So it's not saying you can't practice your faith robustly. It's meaning you practice your faith, and you also let the person next to you and encourage the person next to you to also practice their faith.
Yeah, I think that's really good point to kind of bring this discussion in for a landing, is that we're not talking about having to check your faith at the door of government,
right,
but rather a respect for everyone to exercise and believe and live by those beliefs.
Right, and respecting people that have no faith at all. One of my dearest prisoners of conscience is Raif Badawi in Saudi Arabia, who has just questioned faith and was put in prison for that. He has the right to question his faith. Anyone has a right to believe or not to believe. I always, tell people, if you don't have a right to be an atheist, I can assure you, you don't have a right to be a Christian. So, these are all intertwined together, and we need to, set the table for people of all faiths or none at all to be able to sit together. Thank you.
Final, Nadine, final question for you. When you look at America's role in religious freedom, how significant is our influence as the world looks to the United States?
Our influence is unmatched. There's no one else in the world that has the influence we have, that have the levers we have. And, when I look at our policy, I look at a country like Syria. I don't think religious freedom has ever been at the table when they've discussed a future for Syria. I think it has to be. I think if we want a political solution that's a long term. When you look at Afghanistan or Iraq, these different countries, gosh, I always say we're really good at war. The Department of Defense, we're really good at diplomacy, keeping nation states happy. So we're really good at those two things, that in-between governance of how to build societies that respect religious freedom and how to encourage it from the grassroots. That's harder. And I know it's a matter of priority, right? And obviously security is always going to be the top priority, and I understand that. But I love how, we're rethinking how to set the table so that religious freedom is at the table. We saw that with the last administration. I've been thrilled by so many of the comments of Secretary Blinken indicating human rights is going to be at the center of foreign policy, and we're looking forward to seeing how religious freedom is going to fit into that. But so far, the door has been open for conversations at the State Department and the administration. So, I think if we want these societies that we're investing in to have long-term political solutions, if they're not at the table, then there's a very good chance that political solution isn't going to be long-term.
Nadine Maenza, thank you so much for
having
being with us today.
Great conversation. Thank you.